Hello and welcome to Ye Olde Guide, the podcast that uncovers the history, heritage and hidden stories behind towns and cities across the UK. I'm Liam McGrath, and as always, I'm joined by our resident historian, Daniel Gooch. Hello, Daniel. Hello, how you doing?
All right, thank you.
Well, today's episode takes us slightly off our usual path. Instead of diving into a new city guide, we're continuing our long-running series on how settlements in Britain have evolved over time. If you scroll back through our archive, you'll find we began right at the origins of settlement making before journeying through Saxon, medieval and Tudor periods. And one of my favourite episodes, Daniel, that you did was the one on lost cities. And I've heard that's been quite popular and you've been invited to speak on this topic.
Yes, I'm speaking at a charity event. It's for a series of charity talks about history called Curious Histories. It's on Tuesday the 3rd of March. If any listeners want to come, we'd be delighted if you did. There's a small donation suggested for tickets. It's all online, but it's all for charity, so all for a very good cause. What I'm talking about is based on a Lost Cities episode, but it's not just going to be a clone of the podcast episode. We get to use visuals here, show you a bit more of the stuff that we see and we're researching. I think it's going to be really fun. So yeah, if you want to get a ticket, just Google Curious Histories. Be great to see you there. You can ask questions as well at the end if you want to.
No, it sounds fascinating. And I think, as you say, the maps and pictures will really, really help bring it to life. But if you can't make that, do listen back to the episode on Lost Cities. That's one of my favourites. So we've also got a great one on city walls that's very popular as well from this series. But where we left you on the series was the Tudor and Stuart period. We're now preparing ourselves to step into the Georgian era. And that's one of the most defining chapters in British urbanism. It was the era that shaped so many of the architectural forms and planning principles that we really still admire today and that have made such an impact on cities that we visited, like Bath and Brighton. But it's still quite a leap. And Daniel, you've picked out the perfect location to help bridge that gap towards the Georgian era, which is why today we're exploring the earliest squares in the UK, which are in London's West End. Now, London is renowned for its squares, and these spaces began to take shape in the mid-17th century and continued to develop right through the Georgian and Victorian periods, ultimately becoming some of the city's most loved urban spaces. In this episode, we will be taking a closer look at those earliest West End squares and what made them unique and the influence they had. So, Daniel, why are we focusing on the West End of London in particular?
Well, it comes back initially to what you said. We have this series of special episodes. We're covering the development of English towns and cities in chronological order. And the next part, you're right, logically would be Regency and Georgian periods, Regency periods, I should say. But I think we want to stress there isn't really a hard break between the two periods. While themes like planning, permanence, neoclassical design are definitely features of Georgian towns, they have their origins in the innovations of Stuart designers. And the West End of London is the ideal place to explore how these new urban features developed from about the early 17th century onwards. It really set the mould in many respects for later development. It has the earliest examples of town squares and neoclassical planning imported from Italy, levels of suburban growth that wouldn't be seen elsewhere in the country until the next century. And you really can see a progressive development over the years simply by walking around all these squares, which still exist today.
And it's a great walk, and we'll come back to that. So what was happening in London at the time that gave rise to this kind of development?
There are a few factors coming together in the 17th century. First, you have the importation of new Renaissance planning designs from Europe, with designers like famously Inigo Jones, who set out the first square, Covent Garden, in the 1630s, and he'd visited Italy to study Renaissance architecture. A second important factor was demographic. By the end of the 17th century, London was the largest city in Europe, and that was driven primarily by huge amounts of migration from elsewhere in the country. The vast majority of Londoners, maybe about 3/4 on average, estimates of course vary across time, but a lot were born elsewhere, and all these people needed to be housed somewhere. And the evidence shows where these people were going. Most of the population growth up to 1700 had been over to the west of London, much more than in the old city of London, with a population of Westminster, Middlesex and Surrey being about 8 times higher in 1695 than it had been in 1580. And finally, you also had lots of noblemen owning lots of land around London that was just ripe for redevelopment. So all these factors came together at this time.
Yeah, that makes sense. So what was the city like before then, and what was the result of this development?
So I suppose it resulted in lots of suburban growth in London, particularly in the West in the 17th century. As we saw in our earlier medieval cities episode, lots of towns had forms of suburbs previously, but London started at this time to have some really significant planned suburban growth that hadn't been seen before here and didn't really take off elsewhere in the country until the 18th century, aside from maybe country houses built on the edge of cities, but nothing on a grander scale. Where earlier on the outskirts of London, you might have had just fields. Think of some of the names that still exist today, like Soho Fields. You started to have new squares built there, often initially as exclusive residential enclaves, but with poor inhabitants around them. And development was piecemeal at first, but there was more planning of streets that started to happen from about the 1630s, where our story begins. London effectively spilled out beyond the old borders of the medieval city of London to create one single conurbation going up to Westminster.
Now, I'll step in here to give the listeners who are less familiar with the growth of London sort of a sense of what we mean by these areas. So you've said suburbs a few times, but of course, in today's city, that really is the centre of the city. It's the area of the city that sort of most tourists and visitors would visit, and you would consider it to be the centre of London. But those other areas that you mentioned, the medieval cities of London, what's now known as the city, were occupying really, and Westminster you mentioned, were occupying much smaller areas of land. So let's go through some of these squares. There's lots of them, but let's pick out some of the highlights. And what I would say to our listeners is it's quite cool to do what we did and to sort of walk through these squares. They're all within walking distance of each other. So when it stops raining, if it ever does, I'd invite you to walk these squares and take a closer look at them. And I must admit, I had been to all of these squares before, but looking at them properly, it was really fascinating. Let's make a start on the first square, Covent Garden. And you mentioned its designer, Inigo Jones, and this dates from 1630.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, so some of the dates we'll give today are approximate development that happened after, but I think you're right. It kind of started around 1630, took about 3 years for the original design. We're starting here because Covent Garden, while geographically some people dispute whether it's in the West End of London, I think most people would say it probably is in the area of the West End today, is still hugely important as London's very first urban square. It was named after a garden for Westminster Abbey that had been there. And you're right, designed by Inigo Jones for the Duke of Bedford on his land. And this is quite an important point. The Covent Garden that you can see today looks nothing like the original design from the 1630s. If you stand there, you have to ignore the market, shops and every building in front of you, as the original design was purely residential. It was an open square with an empty space and tree in the middle. Around you, you didn't have pubs or opera houses or apple shops. You had arcaded houses round a square with a columned church at one end. The houses on the north and east side had tall arched arcades for covered walkways, while piazza was originally the name given to the space in the middle. People started to call the arcades the piazzas after that. The design has its origins in Roman forums, but more recent Italian Renaissance models were the more direct inspiration, as Inigo Jones, as we said earlier, had visited Italy to study Renaissance architecture and bring some of those ideas back to England.
You mentioned that it was housing at first, but of course now it's really a centre of shopping and leisure and commerce. And how did it make that transition?
Well, yes, it was originally a very fashionable residential area, but later the wealthy residents of London started moving, in many cases, further west. But this gap allowed more you might say, down market commerce to move in. Some trading first started in Covent Garden in 1649, but the first formal vegetable market was established in the 1670s, and the garden became a kind of centre of the theatrical community. Some of the houses became coffee houses, lodgings, and brothels, with, as you might imagine, poor housing built as well. And this repurposing of the garden led to a complete architectural overhaul. The Duke of Bedford's house, which was originally on the square, was demolished between about 1704 and 1706, and most of the terraced houses went in the second half of the 19th century as the market expanded.
Is there anything left of the original garden?
Very little. All the original terraces are now gone. The only part of the original plan left in any way is the reconstructed church, St Paul's, rebuilt in 1795 to the same model as the original.
So there's not really much to see of that original square, but the shape of it and its placement is what it originally was, and now it really is the sort of centre of entertainment and retail of London. Royal Opera House, as you mentioned, and just surrounded by shopping and entertainment. But if we walk a few, maybe 10, 15 minutes north from Covent Garden, we come to a much quieter square, probably less well known, but built about 30 years later. This is Bloomsbury Square, and the same designer.
Yes, I think Inigo Jones had a hand in at least some of the housing in Bloomsbury Square. Again, you might say not in the geographical West End, but I think you dispute that perhaps. But this is an important milestone because it was the first of these developments to actually be called a square. It was originally called Southampton Square because, once again, you have a nobleman developing his lands. It was built just south of the Earl of Southampton's mansion and created as a piazza out the front of this. The square then passed to, once again, the Dukes of Bedford via marriage and was called Bloomsbury Square by the 1730s.
And how did the appearance of this square change?
Well, the central area was originally a grass rectangle. There doesn't appear to have been anything ornate about it. In the 1800s, trees and shrubs were added. Originally, access was restricted to square residents only, but the railings blocking off the public, keeping them out, were taken down in the Second World War to be used for munitions work, so it became accessible to all. The gardens were changed in the 1970s, but recently refurbished to look a bit more like the former Regency design, with a play area added as well. And you can also find a bronze statue of Charles James Fox, the great Regency politician there.
Yeah, and it's a much quieter square than some of the others we talk about, just around the corner from the British Museum. Now, the next square on your list, 1670, is the world famous square, probably the most famous square on the list, Leicester Square.
Yes, we definitely couldn't get away without talking about this one. Though probably have to say it feels like a much less regular shape than the other squares. You might say it's not really a square at all. It was originally called Leicester Fields, like Soho Fields for Soho Square, and set out in 1670 by the second Earl of Leicester in front of his mansion, Leicester House, which stood where Gerrard Street is today. Leicester House was a bit of a way back from the square today and demolished in 1791.
Now, Leicester Square today is really the centre of entertainment, the cinemas, casino. Well, it's known for where you have film premieres, and it really is a hub of that kind of entertainment industry and theatre land. How did it evolve to this kind of purpose?
Well, the houses built there, they weren't as grand, it has to be said, as some of the housing on many of the other squares built in London around this time. And Leicester Square really did cease being, in any sense, upmarket residential area after 1845, when street widening and extension works allowed more traffic in. It became less residential, more a hub of entertainment and hotels. A market was nearly built there, but instead the Victorians refurbished the garden in the 1870s. First theatres were added and later cinemas, and this is reflected in the monuments on the square today to Shakespeare, Chaplin and Mr. Bean, among others.
I know what you mean. It feels smaller and tighter and kind of less grand as a square. I mean, it's a cool square, no doubt about it, although a lot of modern buildings around it now, lots of like bright lights and so on, but it feels smaller and tighter. And I suppose the next square on the list, the next one built, I suppose, chronologically, is completely different today in how it feels, and that's St James's Square. Only a short walk from Leicester Square, but it feels very different. What's the story of St James's Square?
Yes, this is another really important one. Nicholas Pevsner calls this the first of the true West End squares because it was further west than Covent Garden and Bloomsbury Square, really out in that West End with no dispute. Once again, built for a nobleman, the Earl of St Albans, and was the first West End London square constructed after the Civil War. Like Covent Garden, it was inspired by Italian squares and was residential, with 22 houses built to provide housing for courtiers at nearby St James's Palace. This housing was much wider and deeper than most London housing, with identical frontages on three sides. And many other nobles were drawn here. 6 dukes and 7 earls owned houses on the square by the 1720s. So definitely one of the kind of most upmarket areas that we've seen so far.
Yes. What's remaining there now?
Well, it's still a square with a central garden surrounded by railings and now a road. Unfortunately, no original houses survive, but there are lots of good, interesting houses from the 18th and 19th centuries. Many of these have been converted to clubs and other institutions. Many were unfortunately demolished in the 1930s and replaced by offices, though I'd say the architecture of the north half still has a residential feel about it.
Yeah, it's a very upmarket area, as you mentioned, clubs and quite high class businesses. Now, I'm going to bring us back into sort of the entertainment district and bring us back into Soho and Golden Square, which was Christopher Wren most likely designed, who's well known for St Paul's Cathedral and lots of churches in the city, but potentially also this square.
Yes, there is some dispute about whether he designed it and to what extent he was involved in it, but certainly his name has been attached to it. Golden Square is also an early square. From, I think, 1675 it was first designed. But while it's very posh now, it was built on the site of a 17th century plague pit and became, I suppose, a tad less salubrious and posh than many of the other West End squares by the 19th century. Like other squares, it was originally built to house the wealthy, but cloth makers moved in and set up shops in the mid-19th century. Later, Booth's famous poverty map, his map of 1889, which depicts poverty and class in London, classed the square itself as fairly comfortable, good ordinary earnings, whereas most of the other squares in London at this time were upper middle and upper classes wealthy, with the streets surrounding it on two sides full of the poor and very poor. So you can see it's not really this kind of upmarket residential area by the 19th century compared with some of the other squares.
But it's changed a lot, hasn't it? It is now.
Yes.
Yeah, upmarket, absolutely. And coming in again back into the core of London's entertainment district, which is Soho, but even more so nearby Soho Square, again, a sort of 10-minute walk from Golden Square to Soho Square. Quite a similar square in terms of scale, built 1677.
Yes. This square is notable because it's possibly the first London square to have a garden. They're quite commonplace now. You might not even think about it, but they weren't always there. And the plan of the garden is the original, more or less the original design, though trees have been added and it's been tinkered with in some ways. The square was built on Soho Fields, so its original setting, as with many of them, must have felt more rural. It had 41 houses added and had a higher social class than Golden Square and Leicester Square, no doubt. Monmouth House stood between the entrance street on the south side. This house was built for the famous Duke of Monmouth in 1682. Duke of Monmouth was the illegitimate son of Charles II, whose statue is on the square now, and the Duke of Monmouth led an unsuccessful rebellion against Charles II's brother, James II, and was beheaded after this. This house was later improved, but replaced by, I think you'd have to say, Plainer House in 1773. Like with other squares, nobility and residential usage on this square were later replaced by trade and institutions. And I want to talk a bit more about that statue of Charles II. It was added in the 17th century. I have to say, it's not that impressive. It looks very, very weathered. It was originally part of a larger monument with 4 rivers around him, but now he's there on his own. And Soho Square is also notable for football fans as being the former home of the FA. They moved there from Lancaster Gate in 2000, stayed there until 2009 when I think they moved out to Wembley.
Yeah, and it's also the only real green space in the area, so it gets really busy in the summer. So the squares you mentioned so far really are the first squares. We're going to move on in time a little bit. We're going to cross Oxford Street just to the north to Cavendish Square. It's laid out 1717. What's the story of Cavendish Square?
Yes, this was first built yet again for another noble, the second Earl of Oxford, Edward Harley, after whom two famous London roads, Harley Street and Oxford Street, are named, and his family still own a large estate surrounding Cavendish Square. But I like this square for something a bit more quirky, a more recent addition. The big double helix car park under the square, which was built into an old access shaft for construction of the Victoria Line. Herbert Asquith, Prime Minister at the start of the First World War, lived at number 20, and it's famous for a literary appearance in Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. One of Jekyll's friends lives on the square. There's a statue of Lord Bentinck, a 19th century politician who isn't particularly well known, but probably the most conspicuous statue is the one that's absent, that of Butcher Cumberland, Duke of Cumberland, George II's son, who led the British forces to victory at Culloden. It was taken down in the 1860s because people had a very different and unfavourable view of him back then, and only the empty plinth remains there now.
Still empty?
Mm-hmm.
And you won't be surprised with my transport nerdery hat on. I do love the fact about the double helix Victoria Line, although nothing to do with the square really, no. but a great fact nevertheless. Now, if we cross over into Mayfair, we've got two more squares left on the list, and I think these two are much larger and grander, and I think are starting to bridge into our next era. We're going to go with Grosvenor Square, which is a very famous square. 1725. Tell us what's interesting about this square.
It's Grosvenor Square. This is an interesting one to look at for a few reasons. First, its size and its shape. It's 6 acres, round, almost a circle. It's the second largest square in London, I think, after Russell Square. Second, it's interesting for its architectural features. It was built with 51 houses and pretty groundbreaking because the houses weren't just uniform. They weren't just the same design, but built as part of a greater continuous structure. The east side of the housing, for example, had a pediment going over all the housing in the centre and was taller at the ends, while the north side of the housing had 3 houses with a pediment. So you weren't just getting uniform designs of separate housing, you were getting separate houses built as one grander uniform design. Despite this, the housing was in some senses a tad less similar to each other than later squares. Many were, even though a part of a bigger design, individually designed. Some had painted stair halls inside that presented a kind of illusion of scenery around the stairs. One painting from a house demolished in 1967 is in the Victoria and Albert Museum with a balcony and arcade of arches leading into the sky. You can see a picture of it on their website if you want to see what I mean. The third notable thing about this square is its connections with America. The garden planned by the government Ministry of Works was a memorial to Franklin Roosevelt, whose statue is at the north and became a public garden then. And that statue was built here because of those American links. The first American mission to the Royal Court was established in the square in 1785 by John Adams, who lived in a house that still stands there, number 9. General Eisenhower set up a military headquarters at number 20 in the Second World War, and the American embassy was here in 2 different buildings before 2008. I was actually watching TV the other night, and someone, to emphasise he'd been in contact with the CIA, was talking how he'd just been down Grosvenor Square. It's still got in kind of the popular imagination these associations instantly with America.
Yeah, absolutely. The embassy itself has moved to Battersea, but still that association. There's been a lot of change. What is there now?
In many senses, it's a very modern square. The houses have undergone lots of rebuilding, first in the 19th century. Most were completely redone in the 1920s to 1960s. So there are only 3 pre-20th century houses still there. The garden, again, is a modern design, designed in 1947 to 1948. Those American links are still strong, though. As well as the statue of Roosevelt, there are statues of Ronald Reagan and Eisenhower, a 9/11 memorial garden, an eagle squadron's memorial, and one of the former embassy buildings still dominates the square and is now a hotel with the massive embassy eagle still hanging over it.
A very fancy hotel, as I understand it, as well, as you'd expect. Nothing less, because we're in Mayfair. And we've got one more square, which is also in Mayfair, which is Berkeley Square.
Yes, one of the most famous squares again because of the song Nightingale sang in Berkeley Square. But it's also interesting because of its design. It's got this interesting stadium shape with straight sides and curved ends. And because it was built in a slightly more piecemeal way than other squares, it isn't as regularly planned as them. The road kinks at the north side and the entrance roads come in a kind of haphazard way. The first garden was put there in the 1740s, and it was properly developed from about 1766, when the garden was given the distinctive round ends. Historically, this is one of the most fashionable places in London, and its origins are when 3rd Lord Berkeley, who owned some of the surrounding streets, sold his house here to the Duke of Devonshire in 1696, the Duke promising to keep the north side free of buildings so its view was clear. As a result, when the 4th and 5th Lords started building houses on Berkeley Street, the east side of the square in 1738 and the west side respectively, they kept that promise and built nothing on the north side. This meant that the north side houses weren't rebuilt to be part of the square until much later in the 1820s. The buildings on the south side were originally standing on what was gardens for Lansdowne House, a large aristocratic townhouse. These were built over in the 1930s and I think have had some rebuilding work done recently. Unfortunately, most of the Georgian buildings were taken down too in the 1930s, though there are some still remaining on the west side.
Yeah, and it remains a most salubrious corner of central London. The Monopoly board does not lie. Now, I will anticipate a challenge. When you said that Grosvenor Square was the largest square, someone will obviously point out that Lincoln's Inn Fields is bigger. But is it a square? We've said it isn't. That's what we're going with. But we've gone through quite a few squares now, and I think we'll leave the squares for now. I think we've arrived at the planned Georgian period. And I think if we continued looking at squares in west of London, we'd probably get to Manchester Square, and we're firmly in an era of this new urban form, which is no longer so experimental and it's much more planned, with great estates being built. And we're moving into the era where the planned square is fully established. And I suppose by that stage, spreading beyond London, is it fair to say, to places we've visited like Bath and Brighton?
Yep, and that's where we'll pick this up, firmly in the Georgian era.
Now, I really enjoyed our walk round the squares, and I would recommend, as I say, it's all walkable. You can easily walk Covent Garden, Leicester Square, St James's Square, Golden Square, Soho Square, Cavendish Square, Berkeley Square, and Grosvenor Square. All very easy walking distance. Perhaps do it in that order. I missed off Bloomsbury Square. I'm sure you can squeeze that in too. Now, what I love about these early West End squares is how dramatically they have shaped London's development. Instead of buildings being strung haphazardly along medieval streets and lanes, we're starting to see a new level of organisation and hierarchy and intentionality in the urban form. But this is still a period of experimentation, which is why it's this bridging period. And each of the squares we've discussed has its own character. I think that came through in your descriptions, Daniel. There's quite a bit of difference between those squares. The next episode in the series will be moving into the Georgian era, where we're starting to see more standardized and systematic urban forms. But even at the early stage we've discussed, the impact is transformative. The result that remains is a very well-known and enjoyed urban fabric. Soho Square, Covent Garden, Leicester Square. These are some of London's most famous and cherished neighbourhoods and spaces. They're the beating heart of entertainment, retail and tourism. So something about this urbanism works. It's been very successful and has been a benchmark for the development of the rest of the city. Do you have any more thoughts on these squares, Daniel?
I suppose just to say which was your favourite? Do you have a favourite, the ones we visited?
The one that I enjoyed the most when we visited was St James's Square, just for the layout of the park as it now is in effect, and the buildings around the edge. I guess I don't visit there very often, to be honest. because it's not so well known for visitors and tourists. Less entertainment around it.
I was going to say the same, actually. I was going to say St James's Square as well. So yeah, clearly it's impressed us. Yeah, I did like it. It had a nice kind of tucked away vibe to it, which feels strange saying that when it's in such a busy part of London. But you felt you were in an old historic area. There were institutions you'd heard of, like Chatham House, the London Library, and of course, as Pevsner said, it is one of the most important squares, one of the most important urban squares in the development of West End London. It's kept that kind of upmarket vibe, but the garden in the centre was still accessible, being enjoyed by lots of people at lunchtime. So, yeah, I'd say St James's Square was my favourite. Purely subjective, of course.
It is subjective. We also benefited from lovely weather when we did our walk of the West End squares. So, up to you. Leave it till summer or bring an umbrella. Well, that's all we have time for on London's West End squares. I really enjoyed that. Fascinating. And the next episode in this series on the development of settlements in Britain, I guess, will be the Georgian era, Daniel. But before then, where is our next city guide?
I'm well on the way with research for Oxford. I've had our visit there. I've been there many times, actually, given it's just down the road. So, yeah, Oxford will be coming up next. I can guarantee that will be multi-part. There is an awful lot to say that's interesting about Oxford.
High expectations for Oxford. You can find all our episodes at yeoldeguide.com and all podcast directories. We love ratings and reviews and comments, and our episodes are now coming up on YouTube. We press the button to happen. So you can also listen to the episodes there and leave comments as well. Thank you for listening. See you next time.
Thank you.